When you're driving uptown to Mendon Center, going past Old Cemetery in good weather, maybe on a quiet summer morning with your windows rolled down and the birds chirping, take a listen towards where the foundation of Mendon's fourth meeting house was located. Can you hear the shouting? The echoes of "Give us liberty"?
A motion here.
You can hear it, can't you? I'm sure you can. It's Joseph Dorr, Edward Rawson, and the rest of Mendon patriots crying out, "Liberty or death." Of course they are. That's right. In this Mendon moment in time, you'll learn how little old Mendon was so impactful to America's beginning. It seems that we begin or end every episode of our mini-series with a battle or a war or some sort of confrontational chaos, doesn't it? Sadly, this episode is no different. The French and Indian War ends when this episode begins, 1763. Mendon had, of course, mustered her troops in support of the war. Why wouldn't she? After all, she was British at that time, you'll all remember. But not for long. That familiar tune that you're listening to is typically associated with the American Revolution. But no! Yankee Doodle's lyrics were thought to have been composed by the British during the French and Indian War to mock the ragtag colonists fighting alongside the finely drilled and nattily attired redcoats. Just imagine calling Mendon's militia a bunch of ragtag militia. Gets my goat. Intended as a derisive taunt, the Patriots proudly adopted the tune during the soon-to-be American Revolution. The French and Indian War is retrospectively regarded as one of the first true global or world wars, having taken place almost 160 years before what is commonly known as World War I. Meanwhile, in 1763 Mendon, townfolk were returning to raising their families, managing their community, and living their faith. We remember from our prior episode, Out of Ashes, how religious protocol was tested during Mendon's Great Awakening of the early 1740s. And of course, who can forget the battles royale over the North Avenue Farm Road to Muddy Brook and the building of the fourth meeting house? The more that things change, the more that they stay the same. Finally, the men had returned from war to their homes and farms, at last. In town, they were constructing new roads and repairing old ones. New pounds were being built, while others were simply being shored up. Life was getting back to normal. Colonists were buoyed by the signing of the Treaty of Paris in August of '63, hoping that the new peace would eliminate old geographic barriers and open up opportunities for growth. But no, the British Royal Proclamation of 1763, signed by the recently anointed King George III, totally closed expansion to the west. Probably not of much concern to the people of Mendon, but still another obstruction limiting colonial potential. Perhaps a sign of irksome abuses to come. More important to the agrarian people of Mendon and the colonies in general was the fact that Britain had accumulated great debt while prosecuting the war. Who would pick up the tab? The mother country made that perfectly clear. The colonies would. Whoops.
It all started back in 1607 with the first successful English settlement, Jamestown, Virginia, soon followed by Plymouth, Massachusetts. Over the next 130 years, cities developed, and in 1754, the entire East Coast was established as the 13 British colonies. The British were not the only ones establishing colonies. The French were starting their own colonies in the area now known as Canada. Then, the French and British started getting into arguments over territory. And then, from 1756 to 1763, the French and the Indians fought against the British and the colonists in the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. The colonists and the British won the war. To make it official, the British and the French signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Not only did the treaty end the war, but it also granted the British control of the territory from the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains. But the war had left the British with a bunch of debt, so they taxed the American colonists. A lot. And then, in 1765, they passed the Stamp Act, and all important papers and documents needed to be produced in Great Britain and have a special stamp, and the American colonists had to pay for this too. Even with new territory, colonists were very angry that the British were robbing them of their hard earnings by making them pay unreasonable taxes on things like tea and postage. And there was nothing they could do about it because they didn't even have any representation in the British Parliament. They had had enough, so they decided to stop paying taxes completely. But they were just getting started.
The issue of who would pay the financial burden of the French and Indian War had devastating consequences on the relationship between the colonists and Great Britain. Members of Parliament thought that the colonists should pay for it through a variety of duties and taxes put on British goods. People in the colonies thought differently. Mendon certainly was a part of that dissent. Colonists reasoned that the government body imposing these financial demands on them gave them no say in the matter. They were British citizens who had no representation in Parliament. It was this disagreement, this discord, this anger, and a sequence of events that shook the foundation of the British Empire and rattled the monarchies of Europe.
London, spring of 1765. A debate in Parliament over what seems to be a very small shift in colonial policy. Running the overseas provinces has become extremely expensive. Parliament announces that for the first time, the Americans will pay a small tax, not to their local legislatures, but directly to England.
I think that's the first thing that one has to say, looking back on it, seeing now, as we must do, that this was the opening of something which was going to be very big and very important. The British government had a variety of bits of legislation in hand, dealing with a variety of problems, as governments do. This was one of them, a moderately prominent piece of legislative programme of 1765, tidying up various details of the administration of colonies, but it wasn't really a subject of vast interest. It was rather technical. It was extremely remote. If you had stopped the average man in the street and said, "What do you think about the Stamp Act, my man?" He would have said, "What?"
It is called the Stamp Act because taxed items will have to carry a stamp, paid for by the user. Test pressings are made, and the new tax is set to go into effect in the fall. It takes 6 weeks by sailing ship for news of the tax to cross the ocean. When it arrives, the news creates a firestorm up and down the continent. For the colonial elite, the men who run the local legislatures, the Stamp Act is an outrage. It seems to confirm their worst suspicions, that they are not respected in England, not worth even being consulted about this change in policy. George Washington is a delegate sitting in the Virginia legislature.
The Stamp Act, imposed on the colonies by the Parliament of Great Britain, is an ill-judged measure. Parliament has no right to put its hands into our pockets without our consent.
Even royal appointees like the highly regarded Thomas Hutchinson, Chief Justice of Massachusetts, are upset.
You must not deprive the colonies of their right to make laws for themselves. Parliament should only make laws necessary for the empire as a whole.
The larger meaning of their life was wrapped up in being Britons. They were proud not to be Dutch, not to be French, not to be Spanish colonists, but to be British colonists, and to have, for 150 years, taxed themselves, governed themselves, behaved just like independent Englishmen did, although they were living in America. Now suddenly the Stamp Act implied that they were going to be governed, taxed by a parliament a long way away in which they had no representatives. Now, the only people who were taxed without their consent in Britain were servants, people who didn't have any property, women, children. And so the Stamp Act seemed to Americans to reduce Americans to the same status as servants and women and all those dependent people who were civilly emasculated. That is, they didn't have any public role in their own governance.
Though most people of all 13 colonies were not in agreement with the financial demands from across the ocean, Boston, Massachusetts became the focus of colonial contention. A group of men, the Sons of Liberty, actively protested against taxes being imposed on them. One of them, James Otis, called it taxation without representation. Other members included Sam Adams, Paul Revere, John Hancock, Ebenezer Dorr, and Dr. Joseph Warren. They met from time to time at a building called Faneuil Hall to discuss what must be done and how to deal with Parliament and King George III. They felt that rulers of Britain had clearly taken away their liberty and that British actions were a form of tyranny. Faneuil Hall became known as the cradle of liberty of the colonies. In Mendon, it was in the fourth meeting house that these cries of abuse were heard loudest. The fourth meeting house, completed in 1736, had some similar comparisons to Boston's Faneuil Hall. Faneuil Hall, built in 1742, was known as the Cradle of Liberty because it was where the Sons of Liberty met from the 1760s through 1775 to discuss the various acts of Parliament and how they should respond to them. It is where men like Sam Adams, John Hancock, Joseph Warren, and Paul Revere gave rousing, fiery speeches to create patriotic enthusiasm in how Parliament and King George were treating them unfairly.
There's been an incident in the colony. A group of rebels causing mischief and mayhem in the streets.
These are our streets!
Gentlemen, you will henceforth be known as the Minutemen.
Historian Gustavus B. Williams described the very close affiliation with Mendon's leaders by saying that, I quote, "Cries for freedom from tyranny in Boston echoed off the walls of the Fourth Meeting House." The Fourth Meeting House was Mendon's Faneuil Hall in days leading up to the American Revolution.
Let us not concern
A list of resolves, Johnson. Will you second them when I propose them?
acquiesce to all the decisions of the Supreme Legislature.
Yes.
Further resolutions?
Mr. Speaker, a motion here. Gentlemen.
Contrary to what we have heard, the stamp tax will invade every inch of American life. The Honourable House of Commons in England have of late drawn into question how far the General Assembly of this colony have the right to enact laws for the laying of taxes and imposing of duties. Resolved, therefore, that the General Assembly of this colony have the only and sole exclusive right and power to lay taxes and impositions upon the inhabitants of this colony. That the taxation of the people by themselves or by persons chosen by themselves to represent them, who know only what taxes the people can bear. Resolved. Any person heard speaking to the contrary shall be considered an enemy of the colony.
What was Mendon like back then? Mendon in the 1760s and 1770s was a robust center of agriculture and transportation. Her citizens were hard-working, free-thinking farmers who from dawn to dusk made their living from the soil. The oldest interstate highway in North America, Middle Post Road, ran just north of the village, connecting New York, Hartford, and Boston. No, not Route 16. Check out the stone marker just opposite the Clough School to get an idea where it was. It ran across North Avenue and right through the Clough School Gymnasium. We're here in front of the marker, the Middle Post Road marker on North Avenue, just across the road from Clough School. Mr. Grady, you're holding a map there from 1831. Middle Post Road was the road, the highway back then. Tell me a little bit about that, will you please?
Sure. It was, it's the oldest interstate highway in North America.
Another interstate route crisscrossed the town center connecting Worcester and Providence. So the village became a stagecoach stopover, a resting place for weary travelers. Passengers could get a good night's sleep, a hot meal, and share news and ideas. The town was characterized in many ways. There were beautiful sights of pastures, orchards, fertile soil, and stone walls. The sounds were those of farm animals and creaking wagon wheels traveling along the dusty, bumpy roads. There were delicious smells from farmhouse kitchens and aromatic smoke rising from fireplaces. The taste of a delicious meal at one of the village inns was most certainly appreciated by hungry travelers. The feel of textures of warm sheets and blankets after a bone-jarring trip on a frigid, snowy night was comfort and relief. Several of the buildings and roads in the village center and surroundings still exist and are reminders of colonial times. The Fourth Meeting House was located at the north end of Old Cemetery. It was built for religious services and town meetings. Many years later, it was dismantled and its timbers rebuilt the home at 8 Hastings Street, currently the home of the Geblines. Amadon Inn at 4 Main Street was operated by Ichabod Amadon and his son Philip. Elizabeth and George Keith operated the Keith Inn. At that time, the Keith Inn was located at 10 Hastings Street. It was later moved and is now the home of Russ and Ann Dudley on Maple Street. Colonel Calvin Smith lived at a farmhouse at the corner of Emerson Street and Hastings Street. His farmland and an adjoining military training field occupied the area of Hood Plaza, extending down Millville and Emerson Streets. A Taft home at 40 Millville Street was built across the street from Taft Pond around 1770. David and Jane Lowell are the current residents of their ancestral home. The pond is now known as Lake Nipmuc. Peter Penniman lived at a farmhouse at 49 Blackstone Street. Janice Muldoon Moores is the current resident. Captain William Torrey lived on North Avenue, then known as County Road. Don't forget Mendon radicals Edward Rawson and Joseph Dorr. Elm Street and Milford Road did not exist then. 8 Rod Road was at the Hopedale town line and then connected to Middle Post Road. Other training fields were at Founders Park and near Gaskill Street. This was the Mendon of the American Revolution, an agricultural town with a village center that was a stagecoach stopover. Travelers brought news here, and one of the big stories exchanged in the early 1760s was that Great Britain was in serious debt and that she was looking to her 13 colonies to pay off her bills. It was through the interaction of our town's representative in the General Court with Sam Adams that Mendon became actively involved. They rejected England's taxation demands. Joseph Dorr Jr., a Harvard scholar, attorney, and Mendon schoolmaster, and son of the minister of the 4th Meeting House, was elected in 1764, just in time to deal with the 1765 Stamp Act. The Sugar Act had been imposed earlier, and it had been met with strong opposition in Boston. Resistance to British authority was discussed and planned at Faneuil Hall. The Stamp Act resulted in riotous behavior. On August 8th, a doll in the likeness of Andrew Oliver, the stamp distributor, was hanged in effigy at the Liberty Tree, a large elm tree at the corner of Essex Street and Washington Street. Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's house was ransacked a short time later. The Stamp Act was denounced at Faneuil Hall at a fiery meeting on September 22nd, and a similar meeting was held 3 weeks later, yes, you guessed it, right in Mendon at the 4th Meeting House. Under Joseph Dorr's leadership, Mendon voters sent a message to Parliament and to King George III that they would not comply with the Stamp Act. This was the beginning of a strong, interactive alliance with the Sons of Liberty.
The Stamp Act was a bad idea, but what could you do? That was the problem. Massachusetts came up with the answer, and it was a very good answer, a very simple answer. August 14, an effigy of the Stamp Man appears, hanging from what became Liberty Tree. Mobs collected, they bring coercion on him. In short, they forced the Stamp Man, Andrew Oliver, to resign. Now, if you got one man to resign, if the Stamp Act stamps were not going to be distributed, well, the act couldn't be put into effect.
The popular fury spreads. Thomas Hutchinson, Chief Justice of Massachusetts, is a passionate believer in law and order. Privately, he is against the stamp tax. Publicly, he makes it clear that he intends to enforce it.
Hutchinson thought the Stamp Act was a very bad policy, but it wouldn't have crossed his mind that you therefore would resist it, that you'd resist it with violence. It was unthinkable.
The intimidation of royal officials spreads to other colonies. Would-be stamp distributors are attacked. Stamp paper is seized when it arrives from England. Colonial leaders propose a joint boycott of British goods. A Philadelphia lawyer, John Dickinson, supports this idea.
The taxes and duties imposed on us by Parliament must be instantly opposed. The only effective opposition is through the concerted efforts of all the provinces.
During the next several years, Mendon citizens continued to support the efforts of the Boston Radicals in resisting British tyranny. After the Stamp Act was repealed in March of 1766, it was replaced on the very same day with the Declaratory Act, which declared that the British government had full legislative power over the colonies. There they go again, sticking their feet in their mouths. In response, Boston merchants and residents met at Faneuil Hall and agreed not to sell or use any article on which Parliament had placed a duty. On September 7, 1767, voters in Mendon elected to do the same. The Townshend Act put a tax on tea, paper, paint, and lead. By 1770, after much colonial pressure, the act was repealed, but a duty would be continued to be placed on tea. That wouldn't work out well. British troops arrived in order to keep order. There was no warm welcome, only worsening feelings and riotous behavior that resulted in the Boston Massacre. What a period in which to live. Throughout the colonies, and certainly in Mendon, spirits were high. Anger grew in the hearts of the peace-loving and hard-working families who simply wanted to be left alone.
Further resolutions?
Mr. Speaker, a motion here.
How close are we in Mendon to our history? Before we return to Mendon radicals, let's ponder for a moment what we possess in our very own backyard. Let's reveal how intimate we all are to Mendon's significant past. Driving east on Hastings Street and past the lights at North and Main, slow down a bit as you descend the hill, Milford Road, and take a peek looking left at the fields that used to be the Taft-Dudley homestead orchards. That distant stone wall that you can just barely see to your left at the north end of those empty fields is the historical south wall of Middle Post Road, the oldest highway in North America. It is the same Indian trail that brought Mendon's founders to Nipmuc Plantation in 1663, and that George Washington traveled during his inaugural tour of 1789 as he attempted to visit with his Revolutionary War friend Philip Amadon. Yes, all this is Mendon's past. It's ours. We're here on Middle Post Road, about a quarter of a mile east of North Avenue, more or less adjacent to the Twin Drive-In. And we're looking at the walls on both sides of Middle Post Road. The walls are still intact, but as you can see, the hills go up and down, and this is what they traveled back at that time. So the Middle Post Road, Mr. Grady, this is a good shot of the distance between the stone walls. You walked it, didn't you? How much did you see between the distance between the walls?
In this particular section of Middle Post Road here, I took 12 steps from there to there. I think it was pretty much supposed to be a four-rod road, which would make it about 64 feet. But as you can see, the road gets wider from place to place. So apparently the four rods terminology is probably the average width of it. It had three sections. There was not only Middle Post Road, there was an Upper Post Road, which pretty much involved where Route 9 is today. There was a Lower Post Road that went through Rhode Island, sort of along the ocean coastline, pretty much where Route 1 is today.
Now, George Washington traveled the Middle Post Road in 1789, didn't he?
Yes, it was a post-inaugural tour, and actually some of the feedback that he experienced himself is that in order to establish a new nation of these 13 colonies, there had to be better transportation linking the colonies. And again, he learned the hard, bumpy way that these roads certainly need to be worked on.
So Washington, again, was not pleased, of course, with the roads typically from Sherborne to Uxbridge. That includes these, and they go up and down. So what happened there? What did Judge Washington do? Did he write a letter to somebody?
Yes, he wrote a letter to Mr. Taft, who provided an overnight stay for him in Uxbridge, and on one hand graciously thanking him for his hospitality, but at the same time mentioned the difficulty of traveling over roads in this area. So it called attention to that.
Philip Amadon, Joseph Dorr, they went to Ashford, Connecticut in 1896, and they basically said, hey, don't forget us. Make sure that if you change or improve the roads, we want it to go through Mendon, right?
Exactly, John. That's absolutely correct. And they were certainly strong political figures of their time from Mendon, and they did make sure that the new road that replaced Middle Post Road did, in fact, go through Mendon Center.
And wasn't that important to post-revolutionary Mendon in terms of reaching the pinnacle in Mendon's golden age?
Absolutely. It basically set up Mendon Center and a great opportunity for Seth Hastings, who had the political clout, the financial background. He had the necessities to basically carry out the development of what is now Mendon Center.
Sons of Liberty Sam Adams and Dr. Joseph Warren set up a committee of correspondence in November 1772 to communicate with other towns and to circumvent the network of the royal government. A letter sent to Mendon was read and discussed at a town meeting on February 10, 1773. It raised questions and concerns in the fourth meeting house about how to deal with the punitive acts of Parliament that recently shut down the Massachusetts state government, closed the port of Boston, and forbid the holding of town meetings. It was voted to form a committee of 6 men to prepare a response for the next meeting on March 1st. The group included Joseph Dorr, Edward Rawson, James Sumner, John Tyler, William Torrey, and Joseph Johnson, all ardent supporters of the Sons of Liberty. Dorr gave the presentation in the form of a fiery oration that shook the rafters of the fourth meeting house. The spirited speech was in the form of resolves, which helped to define and focus on the issues of discontent. It was eloquently written and stated. The following resolves are a sampling of the 19 that were presented. Number 1, resolved that all men have naturally an equal right to life, liberty, and property. Number 2, resolved that all just and lawful government must necessarily originate in the free consent of the people. Number 10, resolved that introducing and quartering standing armies in a free country in times of peace without the consent of the people is a violation of their rights as free men. The conclusion after the 19th resolve was very interesting because it indicated that these 6 scholarly Mendon patriots were well aware that their document was going to create a lot of attention from colonial leaders. It was voted that the foregoing resolves be entered into the town book, that our children in years to come may know the sentiments of their fathers. It was voted that the town clerk be directed to transmit an attested copy to the Committee of Correspondence in Boston. Historian William Cullen Bryant wrote, I quote, that Mendon's resolves and later Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense were the first writings that influenced Thomas Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration of Independence. At a town meeting on July 14, 1774, Mendon voters once again expressed their displeasure with their English oppressors. They voted to approve 3 new resolves. Number 1, resolved that henceforth we will suspend all commercial trade with the island of Great Britain until said act of blocking Boston Harbor be repealed and a restoration of our charter rights be obtained. The essence of these new resolves indicated that the colonies, including Mendon radicals, were reaching their boiling point. Their patience was waning.
As far as the British government was concerned, what they had seen happen was a total defiance of the authority of the British state, not in some frontier backwoods area, but a total defiance of the authority of the British state in Boston. How could they deal with that? They could either have let things be, and there were some people who said that may be the way to do it. You know, the Americans are wrong, let it be. That's what I would have advised them to do.
In an angry mood, Parliament passes a series of acts designed to restore royal authority in Boston. They install a military governor, General Thomas Gage, and send 2,000 soldiers to back him up. They close the port of Boston. Parliament calls these the coercive acts. The Americans call them the intolerable acts.
Possibly this next sequence was really what put the Mendon radicals over the top. They had dealt with the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Coercive Acts, the Intolerable Acts, the Quartering Acts, and all the other indignations. But as a Mendon resident, I can see where this attitude that is displayed about the people of Mendon in this next sequence would be the straw that broke the camel's back.
All through the 1760s, a steady stream of immigrants will arrive in the New World in search of their fortunes. One such visitor is the son of an English sheep farmer, Nicholas Cresswell. He keeps a detailed diary recording his impressions of his travels.
Americans in general are good-natured and agreeable, but confoundedly lazy. Although they come from different countries, it is remarkable they speak English better than the English do, except, of course, for the New Englanders, who have a sort of whining cadence that I find hard to describe. They're tall and graceful, particularly the women, who are remarkably well-shaped. But they all have very bad teeth, decayed by the time they're 25. It is perhaps the hot bread they bake at every meal. The growth in population of this country is amazing. With the emigration from Europe, they are said to double their numbers every 16 years. Anyone with the least spark of industry can support a family. No one fears poverty here.
A meeting on September 28, 1774 was very important with other issues as well. Voters elected a committee of correspondence in order to interact with Boston and other towns. And because Governor Gage dissolved the state government, the General Court was replaced by the First Provincial Congress. The committee was made up of Captain Nathan Tyler, Edward Rawson, James Sumner, Elder Nathaniel Nelson, and Benoni Benson. The representative to the Provincial Congress was none other than Edward Rawson, as he had been the representative to the General Court since 1768. Joseph Dorr was elected to attend as a delegate. In addition, knowing that a military conflict could break out at any time, selectmen were authorized to add to the supply of arms and ammunition at the magazine on Providence Road. The First Provincial Congress met in Concord on October 11, 1774. John Hancock was the chairman. It authorized each town to prepare its militia and Minutemen with suitable equipment in preparation for anticipated war. Each soldier would be equipped with an effective firearm, bayonet, pouch, knapsack, and 30 rounds of ammunition. They were to have military training 3 times a week. Mendon established a committee of several men to purchase field pieces, firearms, and ammunition. They were Dr. Jennison, Captain Joseph Daniels, and Peter Penniman. On December 27th, it was voted to take up a collection for the people of Boston who were without necessities because Governor Gage had shut down the harbor as a punishment. All towns outside of Boston were encouraged to do this. On April 15, 1775, the Provincial Congress became aware of a plot by Governor Gage to arrest Adams and Hancock in Lexington and to destroy the hidden ammunition supplies in Concord. It was voted to secretly relocate the ammunition to 9 remote towns. You guessed it, Mendon was one of them. They were Mendon, Stoughton, Worcester, Groton, Leicester, Sudbury, Stowe, and other areas in Concord, and another unnamed town. 3 nights later, on the 18th of April, 700 Redcoats marched to Lexington. It was the night of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. But it wasn't just Paul Revere. Don't forget William Dawes and, of course, Ebenezer Dorr and others. Ebenezer Dorr was the cousin of Joseph Dorr from Mendon. The Redcoats were met on the village green by a company of Minutemen. After some tense moments, an unauthorized shot was fired that changed history. Several Minutemen were the first to sacrifice their lives for the cause of liberty. The Redcoats marched onto the Concord Bridge and met stronger resistance. They found very little hidden ammunition. Their march back to Boston was devastating, as patriots from surrounding towns ambushed them along the way and killed 73 of them. The War of Independence had begun. In response to the shot heard round the world, Mendon soldiers mustered at Founders Park across from Amidon Inn, marched up North Avenue, and took a right onto Middle Post Road and headed off to Roxbury and Boston. They joined several other companies from other towns to surround the British encampment. Mendon citizens provided the Continental Army with soldiers, money, food, clothing, arms, and ammunition. The Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775 was brutal. Though the Patriots fought courageously, they were outmanned and out-resourced. They forced the British to retreat back down Breed's Hill, the actual battle location, on the first 2 attacks. The Redcoats finally took the hill on their 3rd attack. After the battle, the British soldiers' treatment of Charlestown's militia and people was barbarous. Dr. Joseph Warren had been killed, and his body was mutilated. All the houses in Charlestown were burned down, leaving hundreds homeless. Mendon helped out by taking in 30 of the war-ravaged people. They stayed at Mendon Tavern until permanent housing was found. The people of Mendon also helped the revolutionary cause by quartering prisoners. In June 1776, several British and Scottish transport ships were captured off the coast of Massachusetts. Prisoners were divided up and dispersed in groups to a variety of towns. Mendon took in 7 high-level aristocratic officers of the 71st British Highlanders Regiment. Little did they know that they were in for a rude awakening. The prisoners signed an agreement with the Provincial Congress and Mendon selectmen, which at the time seemed workable. Selectmen were to assist with suitable lodging, food, and clothing for the officers and their servants. But the wealthy prisoners were responsible for paying the cost of all financial requirements to the people who provided it to them. They were restricted to limited areas of town. Not obeying the rules meant that they would be transferred to the Worcester jail, a well-known den of unpleasantness and fear. To say that the deal did not work out would be an understatement. There were many serious problems. No one with suitable housing would take them in. They wanted to be housed near Middle Post Road, and that request, of course, was rejected. They were constantly being taunted, threatened, and jeered. They wanted out of Mendon, and they refused to pay for anything because of the alleged abusive treatment. Captain Colin Mackenzie wrote several letters requesting transfers to other towns. Any place but Mendon. There is no record if his request was ever granted. Perhaps if the disgruntled Highlander officers had an opportunity to talk to the 30 war-torn, homeless refugees who were boarding at Mendon Tavern the previous June, they would have become aware of the slaughter and barbarous treatment by their British colleagues against the people of Charlestown. This is why no welcome mat had been extended by Mendon citizens to the arrogant POWs. Though there were many heroes from Mendon during the Revolutionary War, there was one who was born and raised in town, who reached the highest level of distinction and honor. Alexander Scammell was born in 1747 on what is now William Street near the Hopedale-Milford line, near the current site of Crossroads. It was Mendon's East Precinct then. He fought in most battles from Bunker Hill to Yorktown. He was highly respected and earned the trust and friendship of General George Washington himself, who appointed him the title of Adjutant General of the Continental Army at Valley Forge. He remained a close friend and advisor to Washington throughout the war. At Yorktown, he was captured and taken prisoner. Very tragically, General Scammell was shot in the back during captivity, and he died on October 6, 1781, as the war was winding down. General Lord Cornwallis surrendered on October 19th at Yorktown. The victory by the American colonies was devastating and humiliating to Great Britain. The highly reputed strongest military power in the world was not able to defeat General Washington's Continental Army. The Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783 marked the official end of the War for Independence, and it brought freedom to the 13 colonies to become 13 United States. Americans could make their own new government and laws. The conflict began with a few Boston radicals at Faneuil Hall who were not willing to pay taxes on British goods without being represented in Parliament. This escalated to a succession of events that led to blood being shed at Lexington Green and Concord Bridge. The people of Mendon were firmly immersed in the cause for liberty. The interaction of Joseph Dorr and Edward Rawson, two of our legislators in the General Court, met frequently with fellow legislator and son of liberty Samuel Adams. He had a strong influence on their thinking. Dorr and Rawson brought their ideas to Mendon town meetings and passionately orated them. Their interaction with Boston's Committee of Correspondence in 1773 brought awareness to their scholarly writing skills. Their response to a letter in the form of 19 eloquently written resolves impressed colonial leaders, as 3 years later, many of the phrases appear in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Mendon joined the Committee of Correspondence and sent Dorr, Rawson, and others to the provincial congresses. They expanded and strengthened their militia and provided full support to the Continental Army. The inns in Mendon provided a place for meals for traveling military units. They provided housing for the war-ravaged homeless from Charlestown, and they quartered prisoners of war. They devoted their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor for the cause of liberty. Historian Gustavus B. Williams wrote that, I quote, "Through all the years of the great contest, all testimony goes to show that no community surpassed Mendon in devotion to liberty, influence in the colony, or in patriotic service."
Each day I live, I want to be a day to give the best of me. I'm only one, but not alone. My finest day is yet unknown.